Okay, thanks everyone for logging in to watch this talk. I'd very much like to thank Dolores for the invite to speak as part of the Clare History Week, and also to thank Neve for help with recording this talk as well. And I think the full title of the talk included the dates 22 to 1940. What I'll probably do is focus really just on the very immediate period after the disbandment of the Royal Irish Constabulary, just over a century ago in 1922. So most of what I talk about will be 1922, 1923, which sort of fits into the periods that we're considering under the decade of centenaries. So I thought I would start by referring to a file that exists that's held now in what used to be the Public Record Office in Kew in London, what's now the National Archives. And it's a file that is unique. It was once one of several thousand, but only one of them has survived. The rest were all destroyed sometime after 1922, probably around the 1970s, it seems. But in April 1972, a civil servant who was then working in the Public Record Office in London left a note in this file, which was part of a Home Office series. And the note read, there was much hostility shown in Ireland towards ex-members of the RIC, and the same were obliged to leave their homes. In this file, there's an actual order to leave the area from the IRA, and I think the file is worth retaining as an example of conditions in Ireland 50 or 60 years ago during the Troubles and afterwards. The reference here obviously being to the earlier Troubles, as it were, the War of Independence, Civil War period, or the Irish Revolution, as historians often refer to it now. And so, as a result of this decision of a civil servant, this one file of what had been a collection of several thousand has survived. And the file relates to Michael Flynn, who'd been a sergeant in the Royal Irish Constabulary and was disbanded with the rest of the force in 1922. Prior to 1922, the RIC, which was the police force for the island of Ireland outside of the Dublin metropolitan area, had been at the front line of the British efforts to suppress insurgency in Ireland between 1919 and 1921. By 1922, the force was made up of a mix of so-called old RIC. These are men, mostly Catholic men and often farmers' sons, like Michael Flynn, who had joined the force prior to 1920 or prior to 1919, and then the so-called Black and Tans. These were mostly, but not exclusively, British recruits who'd begun to join to fill gaps in the force from 1920. So for the first time in 1920, the British government deliberately recruited in Britain. And so these men joined, and they were given the nickname of the Black and Tans, and that nickname stuck. While the Black and Tans were actually hired on the same terms as ordinary members of the IRA or the RIC. So really, in terms of their conditions, their pay, their status, there's no real difference. There's no difference at all, in fact, between the old RIC, as it were, and the so-called Black and Tans. But there was a separate auxiliary division which was created also in 1920, and this was a counterinsurgency force made up of former officers of the British Armed Forces. So often Black and Tans and auxiliaries are mixed up or conflated both at the time and since, but they're separate entities. And the old RIC and the Black and Tans, as it were, basically did the same job and were hired on the same terms. The accents may have been different in some cases, but even very quickly after the influx of recruitment, particularly in the summer of 1920, they all started to wear the same uniforms. The nickname came from a shortage of uniforms, but that shortage was rectified relatively quickly afterwards. So Michael Flynn is what we would consider the old RIC, a member of the force who joined before the War of Independence, before the Irish Revolution. And I think it's perhaps telling of the legacy of the RIC in Ireland, first of all, that some of these mistakes are made, and there's often confusion about the status of the Black and Tans and the auxiliaries. But also I think it's telling that the most contentious moment of the decade of centenaries thus far has arguably been related to the RIC. So it hasn't been about a war of independence ambush or a civil war atrocity, but instead the state's ultimately abortive plan to commemorate the RIC or members of the RIC killed between 1919 and 1922. So this was a plan that was announced for early 2020, and the proposal might have ostensibly been about the old RIC, the Irish-born old RIC, men who had joined the force in very different circumstances than those that existed in 1920, but it ultimately proved inseparable. That effort to commemorate those men ultimately proved inseparable, if that was the intention, from the popular memory of Black and Tans and auxiliaries. And regardless of the rights or wrongs of that proposed commemoration, and indeed that's a proposed and ultimately abortive commemoration that may have had some impact on a general election, it is clear that the Royal Irish Constabulary and men like Michael Flynn found themselves amongst the losers of the Irish Revolution. And so that's one of the things, that the theme that I'm going to talk about today, disbanded RIC as sort of losers of the settlement that ended the War of Independence. Michael Flynn was a fairly typical recruit to the RIC at the turn of the 20th century. He was born in Stradbally, County Kerry, on the 14th of October 1888, the second son of Roman Catholic farmers Timothy and Ellen Flynn. He joined the RIC on the 3rd of July 1908, just shy of his 20th birthday. And in doing so, he chose a career favoured by many young men of his socio-economic background. It was a career that offered a secure, respectable and pensionable, if perhaps underpaid, job to a son who was not in line to inherit a family farm. The former policeman who gave statements to the Bureau of Military History, for instance, though in this case men who had aided the Republican side during the War of Independence, they recalled no hint that joining the RIC when they did so before 1919 was something that was unpatriotic. And indeed, veterans of that force generally remember dealing with little or no political crime prior to 1919. In the words of some historians, the force had essentially become domesticated before the War of Independence broke out, and was not necessarily very well equipped to deal with that conflict initially. Following his training in the Phoenix Park Depot, Michael Flynn was allocated to Cork West Riding on the 26th of January 1919, first to Bantry and then eventually to Castletownbere. Members of the RIC were forbidden by regulations from marrying before 7 years' service. And Michael Flynn had been in the force for just over 7 years when he married a local woman from Castletownbere, Annie O'Brien, a Catholic tailor's daughter, in June 1916. And not that unusual that a member of the RIC would end up marrying within the community that he was policing in. But under those regulations, once he had married, he had to leave. You couldn't stay in the same county that a wife had come from. So by September, he had transferred to County Clare, where he served out the remainder of his career. On the 1st of January 1917, he was stationed in Liscannor in West Clare, where he remained until 1920. And this is just an image from the early 20th century of the main street in Liscannor. So this is pretty much what Michael Flynn would have seen while he was living and working there. At the turn of the following year, he was stationed in Lisdunvarna, about 16 kilometres away. Now, it's not clear if Flynn stayed stationed in Lisdunvarna up until 1922, but it does seem to have been the case that the family remained living in Liscannor or in around that area. Immediately after the 1916 Easter Rising, the lot of a policeman in Ireland was not, as the late historian Dave Fitzpatrick put it in his seminal study of County Clare politics and Irish life, an unduly happy one. So most policemen lived a reasonably peaceful and happy existence. The complaints they tended to have were about conditions and pay rather than anything else. But the same month that Michael Flynn arrived in County Clare, however, the county inspector noted the first signs of a growing public contempt against the force. In 1917, feeling against the RIC began to intensify, and the first acts of social ostracism and violence against police took place in County Clare. Between 1918 and 1920, these acts spread, diversified, and became more belligerent. Ostracism intensified efforts to separate the police from their communities. intensified. Policemen were shot and killed, and in turn resignations and retirements increased. By December 1921, revolutionary violence had claimed 95 lives in total in County Clare. Michael Flynn seems to have handled himself pretty well amongst this turbulence and in these conditions. He received a favourable record in March 1921, and the following month was promoted to sergeant. Under the terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, signed in December 1921 and ratified the following month, the RIC was to be disbanded. As part of the process of dismantling the force, Flynn was sent from Clare to the Gormanston camp in County Meath, which was one of a number of large centres where men were concentrated to await final discharge. Sergeant Michael Flynn was officially disbanded on the 20th of April 1922, and he travelled back to the home that he shared with his wife and young child in Liscannor. He'd been in the RIC for 13 years and 9 months, and under the terms of disbandment of the force was granted 24 years pensionable service and a pension referred to as a compensation allowance of £163 and 16 shillings. The family had packed their belongings and had actually intended to move back to Castletownbere, his wife's home place, when on the night of the 25th of April 1922, the house was entered by armed and masked men. This is the house in Liscannor. The raiders ordered Flynn to leave the area within 48 hours and took away, he alleged, over £80 worth of property. The family then travelled to Castletownbere as planned, but were soon given 24 hours to leave that place by the local IRA. And this is a copy of the letter that Michael Flynn received in County Cork, and this is saved or preserved in that file in the National Archives that I mentioned, and indeed is one of the reasons why this civil servant felt it worth saving. So the letter, which was signed by Liam Dwyer or O'Dwyer, Commandant of the 5th Battalion of the Cork No. 5 Brigade on the 7th of July, reads, "You are hereby noticed that you are to leave this area within 24 hours from receipt of this order. Failure to comply with the above order will warrant a severe penalty." This threat then encouraged Flynn to leave his new home, his possessions and furniture, and travel to Dover in England on the 16th of July. He was followed then by his family a few days later, and they actually moved a second time again in Dover. As well as the looted goods, he estimated the financial cost of 2 removals, first from County Clare to Cork and then from Cork to Dover, at over £117, and this included the cost of a new suit of clothes, as he alleged that his had been taken. And he alleged that the loss of furniture abandoned and then later resold by his mother-in-law in County Cork costs a further £96. Perhaps more seriously, the raid on his house gave his wife, as Flynn put it, such a fright that she is not the same since, and he claimed to be unable to afford the medical treatment that she required. The RIC Tribunal, formed under the terms of disbandment to administer and disperse awards and grants, awarded £35 for stolen property and £95 for losses on his furniture. Feeling inadequately compensated, Flynn later submitted a compensation claim for the difference between the value of the property he claimed was looted in Liscannor and the £35 he'd been awarded by the RIC Tribunal to the Irish Grants Committee, and that, under the terms of that scheme, was ultimately rejected. So he'd applied again for compensation in the late 1920s, but did not receive any. He'd also considered bringing a claim under the Damage to Property Compensation Act through the courts in the Irish Free State, but the RIC Tribunal, or the RIC Pensions Office, essentially warned him against taking that course of action. In the longer term, Flynn found himself unqualified, unemployed, and with few immediate prospects. In December 1922, he requested an advance of 3 months' salary, as he wrote, "There is no prospect of employment and my pension is not sufficient to meet my demands." By 1924, he felt safe enough to return to Castletownbere, but his circumstances did not improve, and he remained unemployed in 1930 when he sent a request to commute 10 shillings of his pension to pay some bills and buy a cow, as the only one I had died some time ago, as he put it. I have a big family, he added, and have no other means of getting the money, as ex-RIC men won't get any employment on account of remaining in the force until disbandment. 4 weeks later, he wrote again, and you can see that letter on the slide here. I want the amount, he wrote, the 10 shillings very badly, as I have 6 young children and I'm finding it very hard to make ends meet, and there is little chance of getting any position as there is a lot of unemployment in Ireland. And you can also see then the response from the RIC Pensions Office, essentially denying his request. Flynn was seeking this money to purchase a pony and a trap to bring his children to school, to purchase a new cow, to replace the one that had died, and also to pay some debts accrued purchasing clothes and boots for his family. But again, as you can see on the slide, the request was denied. And it was felt that because Flynn was unemployed, that it was actually better for him to keep his compensation allowance intact rather than sort of take a lump out of it early on in the way that he was hoping to do. And this file, the one that survived, part of this, what had been a bigger series, was the file of that each disbanded man created while engaging with the terms of the disbandment. So under the terms of disbandment, men were entitled to commute a chunk of their compensation allowance, either for living costs or to purchase a home, or in various ways and means, or to emigrate, for example. They were also entitled to apply for disturbance allowances and other grants in the cases of exceptional hardship. So quite a comprehensive scheme to help ease the transition of ex-RIC men out of the force, but not something necessarily that always made their lives easy either. And Sergeant Michael Flynn's Irish Revolution was considered by at least one civil servant to be representative of experiences at that time. His career as a policeman, largely unremarkable as it was, is, however, unlikely to find much place in histories concerned with ambushes, raids, killing, or political intrigue. Flynn's experience of revolution was, however, in fact, typical of many who served the Crown in Ireland between 1919 and 1922. His wife's indeed typical of the experiences of many relatives of Crown servants. And the end of his revolution, disbanded, unemployed, forced to break up his home under the threat of violence, was one shared to some extent or other by thousands of his Irish-born colleagues, and indeed some British-born RIC recruits and auxiliaries, though their experiences are in some ways rather different. In the first instance, British-born recruits were returning home, in a sense, rather than in the case of someone like Michael Flynn, who was leaving his home country. Having served in Clare since 1914, Cork native ex-Sergeant Michael Salter, for example, another who suffered a similar fate to Michael Flynn's, returned to his home in Kilrush and was immediately followed by 4 men who handed him a notice from the local IRA adjutant, which read, "You are hereby ordered to leave this country within 12 hours or suffer to be shot for having assisted the British against the Irish in their fight for freedom." Salter went first to Dublin and then to England, initially leaving his wife, children and possessions behind, to be followed later in the same way that Flynn had done. The process of disbanding the RIC took about 5 months in total. At 12 o'clock on the 17th of August 1922, the new Civic Guard, later on Garda Síochána, took charge of Dublin Castle, and the RIC was finally, as the Irish Times put it, fairly disbanded and put into civil life. On the 27th of August 2022, members of Garda Síochána reenacted the moment when, just over a century earlier, Michael Staines had led members of the new Civic Guard into the castle yard of Dublin Castle to take over policing duties in the traditional seat of British administration in Ireland. And that's the moment that you can see on the image on the slide. Again, interesting that they had to do so on the 27th of August rather than the 17th of August, which was the actual centenary. The nearest weekend, of course, being the Béal na Bláth commemoration weekend. So they obviously were pushed a little bit further down the commemoration schedule. But less dramatic, perhaps, than Staines and his men marching into Dublin Castle, or indeed British soldiers marching out or leaving Irish ports in 1922, were photographs taken on the same day by Joseph Cashman. And here in the photographs that you can see on the slide, the last remaining RIC men stationed in Dublin Castle were preparing to leave for the last time, surrounded by the discarded uniforms of their colleagues. So I think that pile of discarded uniforms is another symbolic image, for me at least, of the change to a new order in Ireland in 1922. Though for former policemen and their families, as we can see, or as we've already seen in the case of Michael Flynn, the consequences lasted well beyond 1922. This is just another image from around the same time, which is certainly by the caption, describes it as the last inspection parade in one of the city police barracks in Cork. It's part of the Hogan collection in the National Library of Ireland. So according to the caption, at least, this photograph was taken just before the Civic Guard occupied, which I think might have been Union Quay Barracks in County Cork or in Cork City. Now, a majority of the Irish-born members who had remained in the force up until 1922, including some Irish-born black and tans who had joined from 1920 onwards, stayed in Ireland. So more stayed in Ireland than left, on both sides of the border, in fact, and made efforts to settle into civil life, as it were. As Sean William Gannon, however, has found, a large minority, over 1/3 indeed, chose to leave Ireland, either temporarily or permanently. So we can see in the case of Michael Flynn, for example, he did choose to return to Ireland reasonably soon afterwards. Others went away and stayed away from Ireland for the rest of their lives. And this is a cartoon that was published in May 1922 in Punch magazine, a London-based periodical, not generally very sympathetic to Ireland or the Irish. But the caption of this cartoon, which is titled "Exiled," reads, "Many members of the Royal Irish Constabulary are paying for their loyalty by exile from their homes under threat of death at the hands of fellow Irishmen. The British government are undertaking the removal expenses of married men and their families to any place in Great Britain or Ulster and providing them with assistance in finding suitable accommodation until such time as they can safely return to their homes or settle elsewhere." And I suppose essentially the cartoon is describing the work of the RIC tribunal under the terms of disbandment of the RIC. And again, it's maybe worth noting in that cartoon the way in which the RIC man is portrayed. He's tall, broad-shouldered, upright, respectable sort of figure whose life has been upturned by events in Ireland. So this is certainly the image that Punch wanted to portray to its readers. As the disbanded men gradually filtered out of the camps that they'd been gathered in over the course of the first half of 1922, Ireland was confronted with the problem of the release into civil life of some 13,000 men, as one report put it, many unable to support themselves or their families indefinitely, and with few prospects, certainly of employment, for example, in the immediate term. A general economic depression and the quote-unquote political situation in Ireland only exacerbated that problem. The Chief Secretary of Ireland, Sir Hamer Greenwood, was most apprehensive, as he wrote, about the safety of RIC men returning to their homes. He had been told on the 5th of April 1922 by the former police advisor in Ireland, Major Henry Hughes, that of the 13,000 disbanded men, over 1,300 were considered in special danger. But Tudor added, any man who served in the police force is in danger of murder in Ireland. Later that month, the RIC Deputy Inspector General, C.A. Walsh, advised that the vast majority of both officers and men enlisted in Ireland will not be allowed on disbandment to remain in Ireland. They'll be compelled to leave the country, and it's anticipated that most of them will remove to Great Britain. A report in the Church of Ireland Gazette recognised the immediate plight of the disbanded policemen. This was what you can see the slide is an editorial published in February 1922. But the Gazette was a little bit more optimistic about their reception in the longer term, about the way in which the Irish public would ultimately view them. And the editorial read, "We know that the majority of the Irish people at present is prejudiced against the police. More is the pity, but that will pass. The Irishman has many faults, but he knows a brave man when he sees one, and there is not an Irishman alive who does not recognise the astonishing valour of the RIC. Will Ireland refuse to receive them into her fold? We cannot believe that she will be so foolish, for finer Irishmen do not exist than the members of the Royal Irish Constabulary." And a letter writer to the final issue of the Constabulary Gazette, which was the internal police organ, it was their own internal publication. A letter writer similarly hoped for a favourable treatment from the Imperial Parliament and the Irish people, but seemed a little bit less convinced than the Church of Ireland Gazette had been. "Things of daily occurrence paint a picture none too pleasant of the future of the old RIC. There should be no delusions about our future, as all may take it for certain that, however small our pensions be, there will be no chance of other employment in this country for ex-RIC men." A Dublin Castle official also pointed out that as members had been gathered in the large centres to await disbandment, married men were separated from their wives and children, who had to face local ostracism and petty persecution unprotected. The latter were, as one county inspector put it, worn with anxiety. And you might read into that, you might see some of that anxiety perhaps in the faces of the men in this particular photograph. But really what ultimately transpired in Ireland in 1922 in terms of the disbanded RIC was somewhere in between the very pessimistic predictions and the very optimistic predictions. And as I hope to make clear in the remainder of the lecture, really there was no universal experience, and there was a whole variance of experiences amongst disbanded RIC in Ireland, those who stayed and indeed those who left, though I perhaps won't have much time to talk about those who left today. In April 1922, a large number of disbanded men sent an open petition to Winston Churchill, who was then Secretary of State for the Colonies, for the use of empty barracks and military protection until they could board a steamboat out of Ireland. "At present, we have to go out disarmed," the letter read, "and we are set upon and searched. Our money is taken. The wanted RIC, when found, having been already court-martialed by the IRA, are dragged off and murdered at once, and many of them have also suffered unmentionable outrages. We've all been warned out of Ireland. Every county in Munster, Leinster and Connacht is placarded that all the RIC are to be shot at sight if they return. Our wives and families likewise are being ordered to leave. A great deal of luggage has been burned, and many of our comrades have already been murdered." Perhaps something of an exaggeration here, but between December 1921 and February 1922, there had been 82 recorded attacks on the RIC, resulting in 12 deaths and 27 serious injuries. A pamphlet produced by the representative bodies of the RIC listed incidents resulting in the deaths of 10 serving policemen, a policeman's wife, and a retired policeman, and the wounding of 6 others, while also recording 73 non-fatal attacks on police or ex-police and their families, and 1 kidnapping. At least 15 ex-RIC men, so men who'd left the force, were killed in the 26 counties in 1922. So for men who had been subject to months and years of violence, persecution and ostracism, but had lasted the course, a warning to leave Ireland in this sort of context may well have come with added force, not least because the protection afforded by colleagues in barracks had gone. as one ex-constable who left Roscrea, County Tipperary for Portsmouth in England, reflected that there was no protection for the likes of me. And so you can see why someone like Michael Flynn might have taken threatening letters seriously. But his experience, as harrowing as it was not necessarily representative. Another ex-constable, Brian Donlan, received a letter at his home in New Ross, County Wexford, not dissimilar to the one that Flynn had received in Castletownbere. And it read, "You, Brian Donlan, late member of the RIC, are hereby ordered to leave the South Wexford Brigade area immediately." In this case, though, the family history tells that Donlan laughed off the threat, believing that the signatory of the letter was more afraid of Mrs. Donlan than his superiors in the IRA. And certainly the family remained settled in New Ross, farming and supplying milk and eggs to the local community. So the experiences, as I said, are thus mixed, dependent to some extent on the individual and also on the locality to which they returned. Over half of the ex-RIC men killed in 1922 were shot in Cork, Clare or Kerry, while most counties saw no lethal violence against former policemen after the July 1921 truce. Sean Gannon has found that amongst 163 Irishmen disbanded from the force in Limerick, only 23 remained in the county by January 1923, while over 70% were collecting pensions at addresses in Britain. So in Limerick, at least, there seems to have been a pretty strong exodus. Even in the more violent counties, however, as Michael Flynn's case demonstrates, the fear could subside quickly enough after the Civil War for some to feel safe to return home. Social ostracism could be subtler or more subtle and more restrained, while at the same time could be effective. So, men didn't have to be shot for, intimidation to work. Before he received any explicit threat or injury in County Cavan, ex-Sergeant Benjamin Stafford could see from the demeanour of the people in the locality that they wished to avoid him and wished to have no conversation with him, with the exception of a few of his friends. During a series of meetings in February 1922 with the representative bodies of the RIC, the Chief Secretary was told that police families had been threatened with eviction since the truce. The children of policemen had been insulted at school. Limerick County Council had debarred the children of RIC from eligibility for its scholarships, and the wife of a police officer had her school boycotted, forcing its closure. And this is just an extract from the minutes of Limerick County Council's scholarship committee, which highlights that decision to debar RIC from eligibility, or the children of RIC from applying for its scholarships. And you can see a query had been raised about the fact that the regulation seemed to exclude all ex-RIC, whether they had resigned before 22 or not, and it was decided that there was no need to change that particular regulation. Former policemen found themselves at the mercy of local suppliers. They could be forced to pay over the odds for goods and services too. Francis Ronan, originally from County Clare and disbanded from Sligo, where he'd been serving in 1922, described how we pay the highest price for everything and pay ready money or starve. Another despairing ex-RIC man pointed out in June 1922 that the feeling of the people is such that compensation granted is of little avail. So essentially, you couldn't spend your compensation on food or supplies. For those who made the decision to leave their communities, having to uproot was traumatic enough, but families also found it difficult to secure means of transporting their goods. Property could be stolen or destroyed while in transit, and one disbanded policeman went as far as painting over the standard RIC bottle green boxes that had held his property in the hope that they would be left alone. Public auctions were boycotted or prevented from taking place at all, and land and property often had to be sold at a fraction of its value. And in some senses, disbanded policemen made easy targets. A frustrated letter in March 1922 from British civil servant Andy Cope complained that the RIC are completely demoralised and dispirited and allow themselves to be robbed like sheep. And in some places, ex-policemen may have fallen victim to IRA units seeking redemption for previous military activity. A raid on the home of a policeman in Galway prompted the IRA's officer in charge of evacuation to lament that attacks upon police and families of police pensioners are very widespread in the County Galway. I feel certain that if those activities were so prevalent during the period of hostilities as they are now, much better results would have been obtained. I imagine that the police in Galway, I imagine that the policy in Galway now is that it is never too late to learn. Across Sligo, where there had been a quite enough war of independence, Michael Farry, the historian, found a campaign of intimidation against ex-members of the RIC, and most of the disbanded RIC there appear not to have returned or settled in the county. And similar to the kind of letters that were clearly quite prominent in Clare, other places like Cavan, for example, saw lots of reports of threatening letters being sent to policemen or being posted up around towns. Disbandment could also have a traumatic impact on police wives, as we saw in the case of Michael Flynn's wife. An attempt on the life of an RIC constable in April 1922 rendered his wife, in her own words, a complete invalid, suffering continuously from sleeplessness and unable to do housework or engage in any occupation. James Tarsney claimed that his wife became ill shortly after he was brought outside by armed men and shots fired over his head, and she actually passed away in a mental institution in 1927. As men travelled abroad in search for new lodgings and work, it fell to wives to settle up property and settle affairs. This could be made more difficult by hostility to police families and perhaps by opportunism within local communities. The splitting up of families could equally cause anxiety for separated policemen. An ex-head constable who travelled to Birmingham, leaving his family behind, complained to the RIC tribunal that he'd got no communication from them for the past 3 weeks. Therefore, I'm in an awful plight. I do not know whether they are dead or alive. They've no money, nor can I get any sent to them. And indeed, police wives were actually wounded in shooting attacks on their husbands in family homes in Galway and Mayo in early 1922. But for every man threatened, beaten or shunned, or every family who suffered intimidation, there were more who experienced little or no hostility in their own communities. Patrick Shea, son of a policeman stationed in Clones on disbandment, and incidentally the first he might have been the second Catholic, I think, to become a permanent secretary in a government department in Northern Ireland. But he was the son of a policeman who'd been stationed in Clones when the force was disbanded, and he didn't notice any antagonism against former members. And in his memoir, he wrote, "The disbanded members of the Royal Irish Constabulary were not made to feel unwanted in the Irish Free State. I think we could have gone to live anywhere in the country without fear of molestation." His family left Clones for Newry, his mother's birthplace, but only, Shea insisted, as they'd no family ties in Clones and there were limited employment opportunities. Many more simply kept their heads down and carried on with life under the new order. And it's the failures to do so that most often survive amongst the written record. Benjamin Stafford's plea that he would be as good a Free State citizen as any they had fell on deaf ears, and a threatening notice and damaged property convinced him to leave and not return. But it's a case like that that we're more likely to have a written record of. The attitude of the Republican hierarchy, who seem to have neither sanctioned nor condemned much of this activity, is likely made clear by comments in a letter from Austin Stack, later a prominent anti-treatyite, to an ex-policeman seeking permission to return to his wife and family in Tralee in County Kerry. And Stack wrote, "I cannot see that I have anything to do with matters of the kind referred to. The case is one of thousands on which no general policy, so far as I know, has been settled. The people in various parts of the country very naturally look upon men who served in the British force up until the last moment as having been our enemies during the war." And essentially kind of local conditions dictated here. So the Department of Defence, the Dáil Department of Defence, or I should say that the new Army's Department of Defence, was able to arrange that a number of disbanded policemen in Kells, County Meath, would not be interfered with But efforts to find accommodation in Cork were less successful. And the chief liaison officer there wrote that, "I'm sure I'd be glad to help you in this respect, but I could not guarantee the safety of the constables and their families if they choose to remain behind in Cork." And to some extent, the record of the policemen as well could be prominent. So if they're well known in Republican circles to have been a forceful proponent of British law and order, they might be more likely to be targeted. Whereas if it was known that they sort of kept their head down or that they were decent enough, they might be left alone. And there are examples of that cropping up in the documentary record. And these experiences were often uniquely personal as well. And I suppose to sum up, it's worth just saying that, you know, all of these men had been placed in an initially uncertain and unstable position on the termination of their employment. But the variety in their experiences comes in looking at how they coped, how they were treated, their successes and their failures. Some were targets of the IRA. Perhaps members of the IRA would have vendetta against either the individual or the force in which they had served and earned their living. Others were the unlucky victims of quiet IRA units seeking to make amends for an unproductive war. While some elected to leave Ireland, the majority stayed, and that was a decision potentially dictated by a range of factors, from personal bravery to financial security. Many suffered the ill effects of prejudice and hostility for several years. Others fell victim to an economic downturn and weak job market, which in turn could potentially inform animosity or jealousy, indeed, if XRIC were seen to be getting positions in favour of others. Migration was costly, and the very availability of financial support from the British government may have influenced some movement. The fact that there was opportunities for them to do this, as much as any fear of violence or persecution. Compensation for lost or damaged property eased financial distress to some extent and offered a sense, for some at least, that justice had been done. But equally, the failure to receive what it was felt was due could provoke feelings of bitterness, betrayal, and isolation. And away from all that, as I've touched upon, were the men who silently and effectively integrated, or indeed reintegrated, into communities in Ireland and abroad. Stories of the ex-policemen victimised, aggrieved and suffering as outsiders are there to uncover. Those who did not suffer, did not complain, didn't label themselves as victims, and who ultimately lived quiet or ordinary lives remain a little harder to account for, certainly in the written record at least, although those stories do, I imagine, survive within families. And so on that note, I will leave it there. If anyone has any RIC relatives in their past and has family stories or documents relating to their service or their experiences after disbandment, please do get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. And thank you for your time and for listening to me today. Cheers.